Hi, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for joining us for our How to Negotiate the Salary You Deserve panel. I'm Hannah over here with Purpose Jobs. We are the largest startup and tech community in the Midwest, and really excited to be convening this group of panelists to really speak on these topics. They are experts in this field, in the HR space, and really excited for you all to be able to hear from them. So we are going to get things started with introductions. We will run through the panel conversation as well. I would love to, if everyone could start to post in the chat, let us know where you're joining us from. We'd love to understand a little bit more about yourself and what brings you to the conversation. So let us know. Additionally, as we go through the conversation, I want to encourage everyone to share questions, post those in the chat. We'll do our best to build those into the conversation as well as throughout the end. So don't be afraid to pop in there. You can make comments and ask questions via our YouTube or LinkedIn live stream. So be sure to pop over there to engage in the chat. But yeah, otherwise, we will get started. I'm going to let our panelists do a round of introductions. And Chad, why don't we start off with you? If you could just share a little bit about your name, role, company, location, and a brief career history, that would be great.
Sure. Thanks, Hannah. First of all, thanks for having me today. Thanks to Purpose Jobs for hosting it. Super excited. Name is Chad Nieswand. I'm a senior recruiter for Signal Advisors. We're a Series B fintech startup headquartered in Detroit, physically located in Grand Rapids, and I've spent the last 10 years in recruiting. First 9 were on the agency side. So I've been in recruiting, account management, business development on that side. Then about the last year with Signal Advisors, helping to lead the recruiting vertical and building out a lot of the processes as we quickly scale. So I've been in these conversations for about the last 10 years and super excited to share some tips and tricks.
Awesome. Thank you, Chad. Yontel, I'll kick things over to you.
Sure. I'm Yontel Love. I am a senior compensation manager at a Fortune 500 retailer, Kohl. I am located in the greater Milwaukee area. I've been in the compensation space on the corporate side for the last 15 years in a variety of industries. So anything from insurance to healthcare, manufacturing, and now retail.
Awesome. Thanks, Yontel. Dakota, I'll kick it over to you.
Thank you, Hannah. So my name is Dakota Bruner. I serve as Senior Talent Acquisition Specialist for AdAdapted. AdAdapted is the leader in CPG ad tech, and we're based out of Ann Arbor, Michigan. I personally am based out of Detroit. And then prior to joining, I served as a human capital partner to large organizations here in Michigan, especially in the tech space, as well as the high growth, high tech startup ecosystem for Ann Arbor and Detroit. So again, thank you, Purpose Jobs, for having me here. Super excited to be part of the conversation.
Awesome. Thank you, Dakota. And thank you all for your time as well. We're super grateful for your expertise. So salary negotiation is what we are here to talk about today. I think that this can be a really uncomfortable topic for a lot of people out there. They just don't know how to approach it in a way that is respectful, but also make sure that they're advocating it and finding what is fair for them as well. So we're really excited to dive into this conversation. Let's just kind of start with, when is it appropriate for a candidate to ask about the compensation or the salary band for a specific position? Yontel, do you want to kick us off on this one?
Sure. So one thing I would say is to understand your local state and city laws. So there are certain places where disclosure of a salary range is a part of the legal requirement, depending on where you are in the process. So there is no federal standard on this. So it really is by state, municipality. So understanding from that standpoint, because there are certain places where you can ask because it's a part of what's required. Outside and over above that, in places where there is not a requirement, I think you have to understand kind of where you are in the process. So, as you're going towards an interview stage of the process, or you've had a conversation and you're trying to assess whether this opportunity is an opportunity to continue pursuing, then I would say that, kind of play it by ear in terms of whether you are interviewing, whether this is like a true lead. But I definitely would refer to Dakota and Chad from a recruitment side of things when it makes sense for a candidate and when they're used to kind of seeing that come up as a part of the conversation.
Thanks, Yontel. Chad, do you want to jump on anything here?
Sure. My take, and traditionally from the past here, I think it's important to have, in that first conversation with the recruiter or the hiring manager during the interview process, I think just to save yourself time or the hiring team time, it's important to align and just kind of have that mutual fit and understanding for the role. It's an awkward question, and you can even kind of like frame it and come into it like that. Like, hey, I know this is tough to talk through, but what are your general expectations? And a lot of companies will share that based on the budget that they have. But I think it's important to talk about that pretty early on, just to make sure if the role's a right fit or not.
Yeah, because and I think also you don't want to get 3 interviews down the road and then realize you all are completely misaligned. So
Exactly.
Also a big advocate of that early conversation too. Dakota, what are your thoughts on this?
Yeah, I mean, I agree with everyone. So honestly, right away, the second you're on a screening call, I think you could have that conversation. Most organizations that I've seen and worked with typically have salary bands in place. So even if it is, if you end up leveling out at more of a junior talent and you wanted a mid role, right? So then you're just offsetting with growth plan to reach those comp numbers. But yes, I would say salary bands are typically in place and they're okay to have those discussions right away.
Perfect. I appreciate that. Thank you all. So next question here. So we've talked about how the candidate can ask about a salary band, but what about the question that candidates sometimes get asked? What are you making in your current role? Sometimes this is asked in some form in the application itself. Sometimes it's asked verbally. And I know you all have some nuances to add to this. So Dakota, can I kick this one back to you to kind of tackle that and how candidates should address that question?
Yes. First of all, from a recruiting end, and I know you guys hopefully agree with me here that we should never ask a candidate what they're currently making and keeping that piece separate. But I think it's important just to ask more so, what is the candidate comfortable making? What number is going to make them comfortable at home where they are bringing their best self to work? I think is more important to hit that and then also hit the value proposition of what they want out of their career and making sure that those things are aligned in addition to salary compensation.
Awesome. Thank you, Dakota. Chad, can I kick it over to you?
Yeah, definitely. And just to build off of Dakota's, companies typically aren't supposed to ask what you're currently making. I think like the correct way you can phrase it is, what are your salary expectations? So I think you can basically say, if you're not ready to answer, hey, I'm fairly open right now. It depends on the full suite of benefits. And that can be anything outside of that cash comp. And kind of working in the startup space, equity is a large component. There's a lot of different stipends out there. There's unlimited PTO. So I think it's important coming into the conversation, knowing what's important to you personally based on your unique situation, and then kind of putting that back at the employer, just so you can fully understand before giving an answer. Or if you do some research up front, kind of knowing what that range might look like going in, using some different tools and having a baseline in your head, but really striking a tone, hey, I want to work with you. I want something that's going to work for both of us, and really approaching it that way from a human perspective.
Thanks, Chad. Yontel.
Yeah, I agree with both Chad and Dakota in terms of how to approach the response to that conversation. I'll go back again to when you think about legislation and kind of what's happening. There's been lots of changes over the last 18 to 24 months. And so there's certainly, again, it's not a blanket situation where every state has the same type of requirements, but there are some very specific laws in place in certain states that prohibit you from actually asking that question. So understanding what that looks like in terms of where you're located, where they really should not be asking that question by law. I think a lot of companies have started to move towards the direction of, with everything that we're seeing around, trying to be very consistent with how we're approaching that question in particular, even in places where it's not legally mandated. So that's one thing that I will say, is that if you do run into a situation where you are being asked, I think referring back to how Dakota and Chad gave some good tips on how to respond is helpful, but it doesn't necessarily mean that they're doing anything illegal, because it's not consistent across the country.
Appreciate that. Yeah, that's super helpful. And I guess, Yontel, if a candidate is aware of a situation where they're not supposed to be asked that question and they are asked that question, could you share some quick tips? I think Chad and Dakota maybe touched on this a little bit, but how can they kind of circumvent that question? And should they be doing anything to let that employer know that, hey, you're not actually allowed to ask me that question? Just curious if you have thoughts on that.
Yeah, so I think from the standpoint, I think it's always okay to respond and say that, you don't want to answer that, you don't prefer to answer that question. And then just based off of your understanding of kind of what you're able to disclose and what's able to be asked, that from your understanding, that information is not something that should be asked of them based off of what they understand and where they're located. I think it's okay to share that. Honestly, a lot of companies, everybody's trying to stay in tune with everything that's changing so rapidly. So in some instances, you might be trying to giving them a heads up a little bit about like, hey, if you haven't heard, this is what's happening. I mean, there are changes that are going into place constantly. Even over the next few months, we'll see some changes. So I think it's okay to share, but I think how Chad and Dakota responded in terms of how to actually answer that question and how to ensure that you're doing the best thing for you. I think those are good tips on how to approach it in terms of not pigeonholing yourself and giving a salary that is below what you're expecting.
Yeah, and I think Dakota did a really great job of setting it up as like, this is what I'm comfortable making. Like, this is where I need to be in order to be comfortable at home. Yes. I really appreciated that kind of approach to it.
And Hannah, if I can add one more piece to that, I would highly encourage candidates to lean into where they're falling on the scale of what they're applying for. So if you are applying for a customer success role, right, and you know that you're somewhere along the line, like maybe you're an associate or mid-level talent, kind of understanding where that salary band is and then what is the growth opportunity there, I think is a good way to close out that compensation question to say, hey, what is the salary band for your entire, XYZ team? And kind of go navigate the salary conversation from there.
Absolutely. I love that. Awesome. Thank you all. Okay, so let's pivot to this question. Dakota, you're starting to dive into this about how they can really do research on their end. So what should a candidate be considering in their own research? What tools exist out there? How do they really start to determine what a fair salary, what a salary that they deserve is in that kind of objective way there? Chad, Dakota, you go ahead, and then we'll bump it to Chad.
Are you sure?
Yeah, go right ahead.
So for this, I mean, especially one thing I really want to touch on, especially when you get into more of like software engineering or jobs similar to, the salary band kind of spiraled a little bit out of control from the pandemic. So we do have this giant range from anything from 130K to 400K in total comp for software engineering roles. So that aside, what I would encourage candidates to do is really understand the company that you are interviewing with or interested in interviewing with. I would understand their headcount, their location, and do some Glassdoor research, salary.com research, just to kind of understand what data is out there and what exists on the internet today that's kind of falling in line with what you're looking for. So I would understand that piece, but then also conjunct that with the total value proposition of the opportunity at hand.
For sure. Thank you, Dakota. Chad, I'll kick it over to you now.
Yeah, Dakota, I really like those points. I think it's important to understand kind of the industry that the company's in, how closely you're going to be touching like the architecture of a particular project or team or initiative that they have. I think that's hugely important rather than going to like a larger bureaucratic company if you want something that's smaller, that'll play into total comp. I think you need to consider kind of your total body of work and personal compensation needs based on your unique situation, in life. So I think, Google's a good friend from this. Salary.com pay scale is out there. And then kind of being on the agency side for a while, I know a lot of agencies have salary recruiting guides that are out there. So I've worked with a lot of good recruiters over the years, a lot of good agencies we work with here at Signal. So I think if you're a candidate, maybe seeking a couple recruiters that you trust and getting those guides and kind of understanding that, since they'll have a lot of comprehensive data included. So internally, we use tools such as Pave to kind of guide those bands, but I think there's a lot of alignment with what's out there. But like Dakota said, salaries are crazy, especially in engineering now. So I think it's important to understand what's important to you before coming in and kind of talking through specific comp details.
I love the suggestion you just made there, Chad. It's like, sure, a candidate can do research on their own, but if they do have someone they know in HR, taking a minute to have a conversation there, I think could be really beneficial. So thank you for that suggestion. Yontel, I'll let you add your thoughts to this.
Yeah, and I can speak from the standpoint of just the abundance of information that's out there. One thing I would say is use it as an input, but also do your homework on the company and understand a little bit more about the organization. So going back to the question, when can you ask or when should you ask regarding like a salary range and things like that? think of it as from a standpoint of every organization has their own comp philosophy, and they structure their programs based off of the needs and goals and objectives of their particular organization. So all the information that you see out there, especially information that is publicly available, that's going to be self-reported information. So that's going to be information that an average person can go out and can share information about themselves. The companies are going to use an abundance of information to pull together what is a competitive pay range for their particular organization, again, based off of what their goals and objectives and where they want to position themselves in the marketplace. So using a combination of maybe what you see out there, understanding that organizations are also gathering data in a different format in terms of using third-party sources and some very scrubbed, clean data to really determine what the structures look like for their organization. But coupling that with, if you are able to get the pay range information, understand what an organization is going to pay for the particular work, I think leveraging those things, I would say, information that's out there, it's readily available. Use it as some sort of input, but also understand, okay, how does this then tie to what the organization is saying this is worth in their company, and how do I fit within that range? So I think the sources is just understanding where you get information from. If you pull from online, you'll probably see a wide range of data, which is sometimes hard to filter through. So understand that it's inputs for sure, but I think understanding the organization is going to be key if you want to really understand, how to advocate for yourself in terms of pay in a particular org.
Mm-hmm. That's great. And so just to recap, and I'll ask for your all's help there, as a candidate is kind of determining what their salary band should be, what they're looking for based on just their experience and the roles that they're applying for, not necessarily on what helps make them comfortable at home. But so it sounds like you all said headcount, location of an employer, years of experience. Is there anything else that you would really add to that list that candidates should be considering as they're trying to research that equation that gives them, this kind of salary band to look at?
I would say specialized skills. I think that, specialized skills are, especially in this current environment, there's certainly, I think about tech and some of the very specific things that are sometimes looked at in that environment. We went through a period of time, especially during the height of the pandemic, where, and I would say the months following, even from an HR perspective, because recruiting was so heavy, there's definitely some specialized skills in spaces that I think to also call out in terms of what you bring to the table, because as organizations are they're looking at the total picture, all the experience, any skills that may be a gap in the organization. Those are things that are going to be pivotal for organizations to bring into the world. So anything like that I would also say is something good to consider about yourself.
I love that. Chad, Dakota, anything to add on your end there?
Yeah, I can build off of that. Yeah, I think certifications, looking for that, and that shows kind of the candidate's drive as well. And I think as a candidate, you can look for organizations that support kind of that learning and development, and asking those questions up front with how do you support education and growth at a company. So kind of those extracurriculars that kind of take you to the next level, rather than just the skill set that's on the resume is something that we always look for.
For sure. Awesome. Dakota, feel free to jump in if you have anything else, or just let us know. We might have covered them all.
Yes. I would say by the time you get to maybe, let's call it the first or second interview, you should have a really good understanding of the landscape of where the company is headed. So you'd be able to, if you walk into the interview process, understanding your interests, your growth opportunity, kind of what you want to see out of the organization. This is kind of piggybacking on Yontel and Chad. To understand, once you have the landscape, kind of where are you headed for the organization? What value are you putting on the table in the next 18 to 24 months? And kind of what does that growth potential look like that matches your interests as well? I think is really good to figure out what that equation looks like and add that on the table as well.
Awesome. Thank you so much. And I just want to share a quick reminder to our audience. If you do have questions or things that really resonate with you, please drop those in the chat. We'd love to hear your thoughts and tackle any additional questions that are coming out of the conversation. Let's move on to, let's talk more about, so we talked about the candidate side. So let's talk more about the HR compensation side of things, more internally within the company. What are some of the factors that HR is considering when determining a candidate's offer? And especially what steps are taken to ensure equal pay across gender, race, et cetera. Chad, do you want to kick things off here?
Sure. Typically, HR will consider, location for cost of living. A lot of companies are recruiting remote. We're 100% remote here, so we definitely take that into consideration. Obviously, first and foremost, experience. If you have, a portfolio that's built out or do any side work, how robust like the LinkedIn can be, and what the candidate values. I think if a candidate's been at a startup environment before, they'll have a better understanding of equity coming in. Maybe they'll push for more of that rather than just a cash comp. If they want the learning and development, looking for a place that has the stipends or different wellness stipends. So kind of, understanding, the full scope of what's important to the candidate will go into the offer.
Awesome. Thanks, Chad. Yontel, I'll kick things over to you next.
Sure. In addition to those things, I think what organizations are looking at, if you think about, okay, what's happening behind the scenes when, they're preparing an offer, they're looking at, like Chad mentioned, of course, experience, like I said, specialized skills, but they're also looking at budget. That candidly, I mean, that is, I don't know if any organization has an endless pot of funds. So they're looking at budget. They're also looking at others in the organizations that are doing the same role and looking at how you compare to those individuals and understanding what's going to be fair and equitable based off of what you bring to the table versus what others that are doing that role are bringing to the table. So a lot of organizations do have, if they're having close attention paid to some of those fair practices, there are pay practices in place, there are pay policies in place. So they're looking at all of those things to try to ensure that whatever offer is being made, what's the impact that will have to who we have currently in the organization, and is this something that we're going to be able to attract and get this candidate? So they're certainly behind the scenes looking at not just this one offer, they're looking at the entire and totality of the team.
Awesome. Thanks, Yontel. Dakota?
So one of the things I wanted to touch on that was a part of your question referenced race and gender and how do you balance kind of equality across the board. And I think that really starts in the recruiter's hands. So ensuring that you have an unbiased interview process or at least screening process is really important. So I'd highly recommend having blind assessments where you're really just capturing the candidate's personality, kind of how they sell themselves into the position and opportunity at hand. So to have all of that start from an unbiased standpoint really helps catapult things forward. So you're really checking, to Chad's point, those core competencies. So, right, can they do the job? Are they effective? Do we see potential for the future? And can we roadmap together with this candidate? I think are questions to ask where race and gender don't really come into play there. It's really just about the added value and that mutual partnership. So that's kind of my stance there. As far as what is going on behind the scenes for HR, we're really just advocating for the candidate. Because once we spend a half an hour on the phone with the candidate, we've vetted their skill set, we've sold them on the company, they're super excited, we're excited just about their potential there. It's really just about getting them in the door, aligning their growth plan, and getting everybody really excited on both parties. So that's kind of, from my perspective, what's more so happening on the back end.
Awesome. Chad, Yontel, any additional thoughts on kind of fair pay from you all?
I think Dakota brought us some very important kind of things. And again, like speaking from the standpoint of compensation practices and policies that are in place, a lot of what goes into that is ensuring that as we think about what is a driver of pay, that it is based off of some of those things that experience, skill sets, things that have, that are ensuring that we're looking at the right things when we're making decisions around pay. So organizations have those things in place to help with some of that. To ensure that we're making the right decisions and we're making informed decisions as we think about candidates, as well as our internal associates. So I think from that standpoint, Dakota brought up like a important kind of point about that. And I think internal policies and practices is another piece of that.
For sure. Chad, anything else on your end?
Yeah, I would say just transparency throughout the process. I think if you're speaking with a candidate that is a little bit lower than what the band is, being transparent and trying to help them to get there and understand that. I think that's where a lot of disparities come in. There's a lot of data out there that females are less likely to negotiate salaries than men, and I think that's what kind of keeps salaries a lot lower. And same with other underrepresented groups as well. So I think being transparent up front on what these bands look like and having open conversations about it will kind of help close that gap as well.
Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing thoughts there. Okay, so let's shift now. We've really talked about kind of static salary expectations and stuff. I want to shift into more of this like negotiation process. So if a company, you all decide we want to make an offer to this candidate, we're going to offer it XYZ. The candidate then potentially wants to counter. Maybe it's not meeting their expectations, or, just depending on how those conversations went. Lots of different situations there. What kind of goes on behind the scenes? So I would love to hear each of you personally, how do you approach a candidate who's wanting to negotiate? And, how can a candidate approach those conversations in a strategic way as well? So I know there are some good opinions out there, so excited to hear those. Yontel, do you want to kick us off on this front?
Sure. So I can speak from the standpoint of when like a compensation team kind of gets involved. So we don't interact with every candidate that comes through the door or anything of that nature. What usually happens if we have any involvement when it comes to an external hire is working with our talent partners or HR business partners. So if there is a negotiation that they're working on and they come usually, to the compensation team, and this would have been reflective of, every organization that I've been in as it relates to compensation, it's really coming for kind of that second view. So it is, a candidate has pushed back and they're looking for more. What does this mean if we do this? So that is then a area like my team that would take a step back and say, okay, if they're looking for this, this is what the rest of the group looks like. So going back to what I was talking about before, is they're looking at how are other people that are doing this job, how are they paid? Is this going to cause any inequity if we, meet this candidate's expectations? And so they'll come in and really what our job on the backside is to say, do we see anything that could cause a concern? So, are we still, is what they're expecting, is that still within the realm of what you're paying people that have similar backgrounds and experiences? And that is going to not just be us from the comp perspective, that's also the business area. So who's the manager for this space? Who is this area reporting into? Who know the people that are doing the job the best? And so I would say on the backside, especially when there's a candidate that the business really wants, they're making every effort to figure out how they can accommodate to get the candidate. But they're also doing that with the lens of saying, how can we ensure that it's fair and equitable within the team? So it's definitely twofold by the time it comes to, the compensation team, and in my case, to really look at it from a holistic perspective. So that's kind of what I see on my side when there's negotiations happening.
Thank you, Yontel. I think you make a great point with yes, we really want this candidate, but we have to make sure that we're being fair to the rest of the team as well. So really important on that front. Chad, how about you?
Yeah, I'll kind of build on Yontel here. I think it's controlling the disparities within the teams, like she said, ensuring that you are really following the salary bands. Then also a similar point that she made is looking at this person, how can they fill other cross-functional roles or gaps, within the team? Is it going to be outside the scope of the role that they're interviewing or receiving an offer for? So I think that's pretty big to figure out and keep in consideration. How is this person going to grow with the team? And then could they move into, something pretty senior or help build a new vertical? So really that longer growth path, I think goes into it as well.
Awesome. Thanks, Chad. Dakota.
I mean, you guys covered it, to be honest. But yeah, no, I totally agree. Staying within those salary bands and keeping that transparent. I think most candidates really respect and appreciate that, companies have their ducks in a row and we know kind of where those limits are. And that also paints a picture for what the growth plan is, right? And if it's outside of that department or what seniority looks like within that team, then what else is it within the organization? So I think by the time you get to the point of negotiation, I hope this isn't a bad thing to say, but I rarely have to negotiate with candidates on comp because oftentimes, companies are pretty creative on what they offer just holistically that really offset that difference. I mean, everyone should be comfortable with what they're making. That way you can bring your best self to work. And I think when you're advocating for companies who believe in that and really take care of their employees, it's really just about adding in those bells and whistles or, if it's learning and development for someone or abiding to a certain schedule or whatever it may be that kind of makes that offer more creative is great. But from a comp expectation or salary negotiation perspective, I don't see a lot of negotiation from that front. A lot of the negotiation happens in adding in those additional incentives or the growth plan at hand.
Now, Dakota, on some of those additional incentives, I'm curious what has your experience been on like personalizing packages per candidate, or if it is staying pretty consistent across the board, for the same concept of, just being fair to all staff members.
Yes. So that more so comes into play with, like, for example, AdAdapted has a flex PTO policy. So everything is, do as you need, find a way to make a fluid balance between work and home life. So adding in those additional benefits to a candidate, especially a candidate, let's say, who's going into the office 5 days a week, has to take PTO to do a doctor's appointment, that type of dynamic, you're adding in all of this extra value add to their life and kind of what their routine will look like moving forward. That adds this massive incentive from what they're familiar with. So that adds a whole different ball game of value proposition outside of comp. So things like that is something that we lean into pretty heavily, is just what we have company-wide that we're offering. Or if it's someone, for example, like our entry-level positions, something we offer as an organization. For example, we'll have an insider spotlight, I believe, coming out next week that'll highlight this more. But we have someone that joined with us at entry level as a business development representative. He learned the ropes of ad tech, learned the ropes of kind of how we position ourselves in the industry and in the market. And now he has this fond interest for data analytics, and we're teaching him how to be a data analyst from the ground up. So, adding in the learning and development or the training on the team and having that flexibility across the org allows you to get really creative on what each candidate's looking for, just to make that, whole vision come to life.
So really looking at the full picture and the importance of the culture of the organization. And I like to call it work-life harmony is my word for it right now. How can we get those two to work together in a really positive manner? Yes.
And it will vary by candidate. So, if you have someone senior who just wants to work with his team and, what have you, it'll vary. So just from a recruiting perspective, or maybe even HR, knowing what incentives are really going to interest this candidate, I think is what you start to lean into, and that starts to work into the offer as well.
Awesome, for sure. So I want to dig a little bit deeper. So I think, you three, are all really good about kind of, making sure that candidates are comfortable having those conversations up front about salary and things like that. But what if a candidate encounters a situation where, the salary, just kind of like transparency is not really happening up front. They're not getting that information. And they get a really low ball offer. And, based on their research, they believe that they should be at a higher pay. What advice would you give to them in that situation and kind of like managing those conversations? If it is an employer that, maybe if that's the case, maybe they should look for a different employer. But, if they are really trying to push through with that company, how can they kind of navigate those conversations? Chad, I'll maybe kick things over to you first if you want to take this.
Sure. It's a tough and awkward conversation, right? That's why you want to have these conversations up front. I think if you get to the end and it is quite a bit lower, be transparent. It doesn't hurt to have that conversation and let the company know where you're at. If they're not willing to budge, it might not be the right place for you. And really interviewing and having these conversations sets the tone for your entire experience and perception of the company. So if there's tough ambiguity throughout the process, that's tough to imagine what else is happening behind the scenes or what you're not sharing. But salary negotiation and compensation is huge. That's why most of us work, is to figure out something that makes us happy. So I just say, hey, based on my research, this is where I was hoping to be, and just kind of leave it open, saying, let me know your thoughts if you have more questions. But yeah, that's how I'd approach.
For sure. Yontel, any thoughts on your end?
No, I think what Chad said is what I would recommend as well. I think, again, going back to understanding the organization and ensuring that you have the right expectations at the onset. So, thinking about, what type of organization is this? What size organization is this? So the hope is that an organization is going to put their best foot forward. It doesn't mean that you don't advocate for yourself and you don't want to push back, but the assumption that what's competitive for one organization is competitive for another one. I think that is probably a good kind of perspective to understand, is that organizations are going to to have strategies in place based off of what the needs of their orgs are. So if you think about, high tech versus, a small mom and pop, there are going to be definitely differences in how they're going to pay. And so I think just having the right expectations going in, and then again, advocating for yourself if you have expected, something different than what you are provided from offer perspective, saying what the expectations are and kind of reiterating those things. And then in the end, if it doesn't align for you from a comp perspective, from a total rewards package perspective, then it might not be the right opportunity. But also I think it's looking at it from the lens of like, okay, what do I bring to the table? What am I expecting from this organization? And then am I going to get that from this organization if I'm getting an offer that doesn't align with what my values are in terms of my compensation?
For sure. Thank you, Yontel. Dakota, I'll let you jump in next. And then also, if Yontel touched on it briefly, but Steve in our chat has asked for thoughts on how to help companies or recruiters know that what used to make might be lower in a smaller company or a startup. Purpose Jobs works a lot in the startup space. So knowing that organization will, as Yontel was saying, pay differently than potentially a large corporation. So Dakota, we'll let you kind of jump on that one as well as the theme that we're on.
Awesome. So I would imagine when you get to the point of having an offer, 9 times out of 10, you pretty much know, right, what's going to be in that offer or pretty close to. So you should be at least close to closing that bar and finding some mutual agreement. If you do feel like it's way out of proportion or you wanted a lot more than what the offer actually entails with total comp and all of those things, then yes, I would do more research just with companies that are similar to the one that you're receiving the offer from. Make sure that it's in line. And if it's not, you can ask those questions. Also, if it's growing or a growing organization, I would start to align kind of what does your growth plan look like as the company grows. Something that I've heard a founder say before is, this is a chance for someone to really put their fingerprints on an organization that's doing something meaningful. So when you add in everything that's intrinsic value driven, mission driven, that you can align your roadmap to the company's roadmap, I think those things should be discussed as well. And even if it's not in the offer, you guys should have that agreement first. So that's kind of where I stand on if the offer is different. I'm sorry, do you mind reminding me of the second question from Stephen?
Oh, yes. So he was just asking for kind of how to help companies and recruiters know that what you make will likely be lower in smaller companies or startups in comparison to larger corporations.
Right. Yes. So looking at the impact that you're able to have on a startup or a growing company, I think there's so much value in that, and the exposure that you get to really take on different projects that you wouldn't be able to at a large organization. You're typically siloed, right? And if you want to do more or be a part of bigger projects, it's typically a much greater process to get to that point. Where at a growing company, you can really put your hands in a lot of different pots and really support the org from different facets where you're getting that exposure. Mm-hmm. So I would lean into kind of understanding, to Yontel's point, the dynamic of the company at hand that you're interviewing with or would like to move forward with, and then kind of how do you align yourself there?
Mm-hmm. Awesome. For sure. Thank you. Okay, so I want to jump a little bit beyond this kind of offer stage, initial job kind of stage here. And let's just talk about like management of fair salaries across the team. We've talked a little bit about this, but there are a ton of factors that we've mentioned today. And as people are promoted or get annual raises, new people start. I would love to just share with the audience some of the behind the scenes. What are some of the best practices that HR teams employ to really check compensation across a team? Is it an annual review? Are there kind of like, salary bands per job title type? So just curious if you all can start to share a little bit on this front. And Yontel, I'll start things off with you on this one, if you don't mind.
Sure. So organizations, can be structured in multiple ways, but if an organization has a salary structure or any sort of form, I would say behind the scenes, if they have any sort of guidelines and standards and practices as it relates to how we pay people in jobs for work. And so if they have a salary structure, so jobs that are in doing the same type of work, jobs that are doing, in the same level of job, behind the scenes, if that's in place, then you would have a salary range that you could work with from that standpoint. And so the natural time that, you would look at pay are going to be anytime there's a job change, during annual reviews, things of that nature. And so from the standpoint of, behind the scenes and how that's kind of managed, it goes back to what practices does an organization have in place. So for promotions, what does it look like for a promotional opportunity in the organization, and what kind of parameters are set for something like that? Anytime you do like your annual review process, have a budget associated with that. And then how do you allocate that among your team based off of performance, based off of kind of what they bring to the table? And so there's, I would say, a variety of ways that behind the scenes it's managed. And there's anytime that there's a change or a switch or you hire someone new, it's always an opportunity to look at what it looks like across the team. So going back to, when there's negotiations behind the scenes, they're looking and saying, okay, what does this mean for my team as a whole? When a performance review process comes up, that's another opportunity to say, well, how am I allocating this among my team? If there is any sort of promotion or job change, it's another opportunity to kind of look at that behind the scenes. So every organization isn't structured the same. So there may be some organizations that have, a established structure. There may be some organizations that do it by job. It could certainly vary in that regard. But I would say that more often than not in this current day and age, there's more structure behind the scenes in terms of pay ranges, salary grades, things like that than probably historically it has been, just for the purpose of some of the things that we're talking about right now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, for sure. Thanks, Yontel. Chad, I'll let you jump in there.
Yeah, definitely. Each organization is a little bit different. We specifically have a leveling framework, and that's for each vertical and role. And there's specific competencies that are built out to kind of help show you, hey, to get to this next level, this is what you need to achieve. This is where you need to be at. It's not always tied to years of experience, but what they're taking on with the team. And kind of like Dakota said earlier, when you're at a startup, there are so many different avenues or verticals that you can grow to build stuff out, take more on, and like really build up and establish your career. And then as far as ensuring pay within these levels, there's different salary bands that we have. We have different tools in place, like PAVE, to kind of make sure those are consistent. And then as far as feedback and raises go, we have 2 feedback cycles throughout the course of the year. And then depending on when the team member starts, they have 1 chance a year to get a raise. So we're trying to make it as consistent and transparent as we can, to really show the team members, hey, this is what you need to do to get to this next level, and we're going to help you get there. So yeah, it just really goes down to transparency and really having that framework built behind it.
Thanks for sharing, Chad. Dakota.
Yes, I agree with both of you. So one of the things I would love for all candidates to know is typically your HR, recruiting, and also your finance team is always working together to align those salary bands and kind of what those requirements are to bump up to the next level. So to Chad's point, so if you're bumping up to something, you're taking on more work, hitting these performance quotas to reach a new role, ensuring that those salary bands are already put in place will be done by your organization. So those things should be done before you get to that point, and then all of those things should be shared with you through quarterly performance check-ins, biannual, and so forth, however the organization is structured. But those things should be in place and ready for you so that you can grow into it with ease.
Mm-hmm. For sure. Awesome. Thank you all so much for sharing some of those best practices. So we mentioned equity earlier before. I'm curious if you all can kind of talk about how should candidates consider equity as part of a compensation packages? How does that just weigh into the full package and offer that they're considering? Chad, would you want to take this one first?
Sure. So I didn't know much about equity before I started in the startup world here about a year ago. A lot of candidates coming to Signal might not have worked at startups, so it's a huge topic that we have. So in order to drive transparency and answer a lot of the FAQs, we partnered with an offer illustration company that we use. So when we're sending out offers, we can show them, hey, based on what you're receiving now, this is what it could look like. Obviously, it's all hypothetical, but there's a lot of questions about strike price, what's the value, and what value can it get to. So if you're a candidate, I think it's important to look at the funding the company's had so far, and then also looking at what stage. A company that's in an earlier stage could have more upside than somebody that's in C, D, or E. And then open or ask as many open questions as you can to members of the team, or if you get to a final conversation like with the founder or leader of a vertical, ask them straight up, like, hey, how did you make the decision to come here? How do you value equity? Carta is a phenomenal tool. I would use that and look at their FAQs on there as well. Each company is a little bit different, but equity is super exciting and can lead to a lot of fun money and success. But it's not guaranteed. But I know it plays in quite a bit to the overall compensation package.
Thank you for sharing, Chad. I would also say I knew very little about equity before starting in the startup world. So same page there. Dakota, I'll let you chime in this as well.
Yes, thank you. I honestly, this is my own personal belief. If you are joining a growing company, if you're one of the first 10, 20 founding members of the organization, absolutely equity should be on the table. But what I would challenge candidates to look at is if you are pursuing a growing company or a startup, even if it's a mature startup, to look more at the value proposition of the exposure that you get, and also aligning that with what you want out of your career and making sure that you're acquiring those skill sets over equity. And the reason I say that is because numerous startups have different landscapes with how they have stock options and what they have available and what they cannot give out to the team, if they hit certain thresholds. So I like to leave that a little bit out of the offer process or away from just the overall offer and getting the candidate on board, and more so lean into the actual environment that you're stepping into more so than the equity. Typically, if companies are doing well and they do have the option to give out equity, 9 times out of 10, they will just give that out to their employees company-wide. And you can kind of, trust in the founders and the company that you're signing up for to do so and to look out for their, employees' best interests. But I wouldn't lean into just wanting to guarantee stock options with an organization just without having the wherewithal or the full understanding of kind of what the landscape looks like for the founders, for the board, and what's behind the scenes.
Awesome. Thank you, Dakota. Yontel, do you have any thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, it's just, I think the one thing that I would call out to just, thinking about the type of organization, a startup versus a company that's already publicly traded, that is going to look very different. So just keeping that in mind in terms of going back to what Dakota said, the value proposition. If you have 2 offers and one is from, a publicly traded company that's already established and one's a startup, I think you're going to be looking at probably 2 totally different packages and trying to balance what that means, from an overall, like what you are looking for from a growth standpoint, development standpoint. So it's going to go beyond the numbers at that point. So that's just one thing to call out, because it'll definitely look a lot different. I think understanding the ins and outs of what that equity is. So what type of, whether it's restricted stock, if you're thinking about a company that's already publicly traded, whether it's stock options, all those things, they all have different meanings. They do a couple of different things. And so if you're not super familiar with it, I think it's okay to ask questions and ask about, like, what does it mean? What can you expect? What other research can you do to better understand it? But it's definitely something that has complexities, and it certainly has a lot of value add. But I think it just really depends on what you're looking to get out of the opportunity that you're seeking.
I love that. And I just want to emphasize what Yontel is saying and what Chad and Dakota both said as well. Ask questions. These are complex, matters. I think we can get uncomfortable when talking about, money related things, but take that step to be vulnerable, ask questions, truly understand what those mean and how they differentiate your package. So just want to add an emphasis there. Okay, for the audience, we're getting close to the end of this event. I've got a couple of questions, but would love to also pop in any questions from our audience. So I want to encourage everyone to post those in the chat, and I will work to tap those in the last 12 minutes. While everyone's thinking about the wonderful questions they want to ask our panelists, I have another one for you all. Regarding, I think, Chad, you mentioned this earlier, you all at Signal Advisors are a fully remote team. I'm curious, for each of you, how does the pay differentiation, is there any, based on where someone is living? I know this is a big topic with remote work really expanding, and would really love to kind of understand how each of your companies are approaching this. Are you paying differently based on where someone is living, or are we just equitable across the board on that front? So Chad, I'll let you jump on that first.
Yeah, definitely. No, that's a great question. It's something we definitely keep in consideration here. Signal's expanded to more than 30 states now. So we're starting to build up teams in California, where traditionally that's a lot more expensive than the Midwest here. So their expectations are going to be a little bit more, depending on the type of role. Specifically with engineering, if somebody is in the Bay Area, you are going to have to pay a little bit more for that talent. So I mentioned it earlier, we have PAVE, and PAVE can show you different salaries based on what tier the city is, based on the cost of living. So we look at it in kind of individual basis, but that is something I think you should take into consideration, with people based on where they're uniquely at in life.
And then, Chad, another question while we're on this same vein. I know I've run into folks who have moved cities while working with a company, and they adjust pay based on that, even including if it's a decrease. Is that something that you're seeing a lot of folks doing, that you think continues to be fair on that front? Curious, any thoughts there?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know if we have any specific examples here at Signal of adjusting based on where people are specifically moving. I know we have some team members that travel around and have gone to some different places. But I think it is important to keep in mind and maybe have an open conversation with that team member or candidate about it. But not to my knowledge have we done anything like, hey, you live in this area code now, we're going to automatically adjust. I think it's a little bit more nuanced than that.
Cool. Dakota, I'll let you jump on this.
Yes. So to give an example here from AdAdapted, we keep our core team predominantly in Ann Arbor. So we're dealing with just that comp expectation, at least from our core business teams. But then now opening an office in Denver, typically it seems to be pretty competitive in salary from living in Ann Arbor, right? The cost of living there versus in Denver seems to be pretty comparable. So we haven't had any issues or discrepancies there. And then with our sales team, so we're across 10 different states, but we do still keep the same salary banding with what the base salary expectation is for all of our sales folks as well. And then the opportunity at hand will still range, just contingent on the quota and right, the commissions that they're able to bring in. Is pretty standard across the board. So we haven't leaned into, if someone's in New York, paying them more for living in New York. It's often sales folks who are kind of already on that same salary band as sales folks in Chicago or, Florida or what have you. So we haven't seen any discrepancy there based on location.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing, Dakota. Yontel, I'll let you add any thoughts on your end too.
Sure. So from like a corp comp standpoint, over the last several years in my career, I would say I've seen certainly a nod to geographic differentials, particularly based on the cost of labor. And so looking at, how much do you pay for this work in one location versus another? And so in organizations that I've been in have had different ranges based off of geographic location, particularly, again, looking at the cost of labor. So cost of labor, cost of living are not exactly the same thing, but they do kind of run typically in the same direction. But as you can imagine, where you choose to live versus what it costs to pay someone to do the work in that place could certainly vary. And so I would say from everything that's happened this past 2 years, the resounding thing I can say just from even networking with other partners in the comp space is that even what was in place, organizations are looking at to say what makes sense now. As I think that the increase in remote working, there's definitely been a lot more attention paid to, geographic differentials that are currently in place. Are those things working? Lots more movement than what we've seen before, people moving from one area to the next. And so I think that organizations, if you find that organizations are still figuring it out, don't be surprised. I think that there's definitely practices that have been in place, and I've been in orgs that have certainly, when a person moves from one location to the next, it is looking at, okay, what makes sense in terms of pay? Is there an adjustment that's needed? Is it not? Because again, you're also thinking about what's equitable in the place that they're going. So people who are working in that place, what does it look like? How are we paying those individuals? And so it's definitely a consideration, I would say, if you're considering relocating, moving, doing anything of the sort. I think understanding what that means and what implications that means from your employer is important, because everybody has their own way of doing it. It may be an implication, it may not, but definitely understanding, the impact of if you were to consider relocating, if they were to accommodate a move to another place, what is the organization's stance on that? what there, is there any nod given to a potential adjustment from a pay perspective? Either way, whether you're going somewhere where it's a higher cost of labor or a place where it's a lower cost of labor, I think it's always good to ask that question to understand. We're seeing that more, I would say, often than not, just inquiries about, if I were to move, what's the impact of that? So I would say that I think organizations are still figuring out, what that means long term in terms of what's happened the past couple of years. But I haven't seen a move away from looking at geographic location as a basis for how people are being paid.
Mm-hmm. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing thoughts on that. I really appreciate it there. Okay, I'm going to close out with one last question. So we might end up wrapping up just a couple of minutes early. But for each of you, would love for you to just leave a final thought on what's the single greatest piece of advice that you could really give job seekers regarding this topic of compensation, of salary negotiation, anything within that realm. I'll give you 5 seconds to think. And then Dakota, do you want to kick us off? If you've got something in mind there.
Absolutely. For candidates, I would just highly recommend knowing your value, what you want out of the opportunity, and kind of how do you align with the company roadmap. I would imagine by the initial interview, you should have a pretty good understanding of the landscape. So being able to align your interests, what's going to make you happy every day, make sure you love what you're going to do and what you're committing to. So make sure it feels realistic, it excites you, and that you understand the value proposition you bring to the table as well. Making sure that the organization is aligned with those things, I think is the best advice I can give.
I love that. And I think that pairs so well with just finding your purpose in work and finding that space where you can really thrive. My philosophy is to be excited for Mondays. So I think it all just goes along that. So know your value and find confidence in that, that you can really believe in yourself. Cool. Chad, let's jump to you.
Awesome, Dakota. I love that answer. Yeah, I think it's along the lines of just seeking transparency. Just lead with a lot of questions. If you're unsure, ask. Like seek the answer and really try to approach the tougher conversations with confidence and know that, hey, this needs to get answered for me to make a decision here. Like, let's work together and talk through it. So I think it's kind of shifting your perspective a little bit. But on the whole basis, yeah, it's finding the total package with the company that you want to belong to, where you feel like you align with that purpose and the culture and the work that they're doing, and making sure, personally, it's compensation, the whole comprehensive package that fits your life. But my suggestion is, if you don't know something, just ask. And most companies, most recruiters will tell you, and it actually helps us, with our process too.
Mm-hmm. Love that. Transparency, vulnerability, the total package. I think the culture that an organization creates is just as important, if not maybe more important, than the work that you're doing sometimes. So I think that really is a really good point there. Yontel, I will let you close us out.
Sure. So they both actually said the same kind of things that I would say. I think just from the standpoint of, yes, knowing your value, knowing what you bring to the table, but also knowing what the company has to offer. And looking at it from a total, package perspective, compensation is just one piece of what that means for you at an organization as a whole. So the development opportunities, what type of culture the organization has, what's the long-term growth that you may have in an organization. Those are all important things. I would say don't be blinded by the number. Sometimes I think look at the whole picture. Sometimes a great compensation opportunity may mean that it's some deficiencies in other spaces and vice versa. So look at the whole package and really don't be afraid to advocate for yourself. Don't be afraid to ask the questions like Chad mentioned. I think those are all important things that you can kind of continue on with any sort of job seeking opportunity is really being comfortable with the uncomfortable a bit in this area. So that would be my advice, along with everything that Dakota and Chad mentioned.
Awesome. Thank you so much, Yontel, Chad, and Dakota. We are super grateful for your time. Thank you to those of us who are tuned in. We really appreciate you joining us for this conversation. Again, we are Purpose Jobs. Check us out. We've posted a few links in the chat. You can see what other upcoming events that we have. Join our Slack community. We also have a newsletter you can subscribe to. And just stay tuned for more things along this topic. We'll follow up with a good recap and a recording for anyone who missed it. So thank you, everyone. I hope you have a wonderful Tuesday, and we'll see you at our next event. Thanks.
Bye, guys.